thank you very much for all of you for coming in this on this very rainy evening. Personally, I would have made the effort. I hardly ever, actually, I'm guilty of often not leaving the house when it's raining. But this is the first time I'm actually addressing an audience in Japan, which simplifies my task, at least the first part of it, considerably, because this book that I published last year begins with the Battle of Tsushima, and most audiences that I've addressed in the last few months, whether in the United States or in the UK or in Europe or in India, it's an easy bet that about 90 to 95% of the audience do not know or have not heard of this particular battle or the Russo-Japanese War. And I have to explain that it's not just me, but there's a growing body of opinion which believes, which asserts that this war in 1905 between Russia and Japan is the beginning of the history of 20th century Asia. And that is the most important event from which flow a whole series of consequences which inspire, this event inspires a range of Asian intellectuals, writers, budding activists, and the range can be testified by just mentioning a few names like Gandhi, who's a lawyer in South Africa in 1905, Ataturk, who's a soldier in Damascus in 1905, Sun Yat-sen, who's already a very well-known activist who happens to be in London when the news of the Battle of Tsushima reaches the world. Not to mention any number of lesser-known nationalists in Vietnam, in Java, in Egypt. The Egyptians are observing, have been observing Japan and Japan's progress for at least a couple of decades at that point. And the news from 1905 is again hugely inspiring for a whole generation of Egyptian nationalists. And it's not just people getting inspired, it's people actually inspired enough to act and to form political parties, political movements. So very soon, in 1906, you have a constitutional revolution in Persia in 1906, which is very, very directly inspired by this event there. And the reason why, one of the lessons that the Persians draw from this is that Japan succeeded because it had a constitution, that it had a semblance of parliamentary democracy, it had a system of consultation, it had a press, and of course, very importantly, it had a highly developed industrial infrastructure. So all of these different lessons are examined, they're learned, and any number of Asian writers, intellectuals actually physically moved to Tokyo, Yokohama at that point to become students in Japan and start learning from Japan the secrets of this mysterious power that Japan had accumulated in the preceding decades. So 1905 basically confirms all this sort of vindicates this special attention that has been paid to Japan by these Persians, by the Egyptians, that here is an Asian power which was bullied out of its isolation in the mid-19th century, and how they have managed to strengthen themselves to the point where they can take on a European power in a war, in a major war, and defeat it comprehensively. And I think at this point in time, in 2013, it's very easy to underestimate the emotional power and the sense of psychological, emotional release many people in Asia felt over this, about the fact of an Asian power defeating a white European country, because most of these people who were so delighted, so enthused by this victory, they all felt themselves to be, quite rightly, most of them quite rightly, to be victims of a racist imperialism. And if you look at the careers of whether people like Gandhi or Liang Chichao, for that matter, a Chinese intellectual who came and made Japan his home for many years, many of their sort of early careers in politics were inaugurated by experience of racial humiliation. And this is a constant in the lives of many of these people. So when we talk about imperialism today, we often tend to forget that side of it. We talk about the economic aspect of it, the political aspect of it. There are people arguing that the British Empire was actually a very good thing. That kind of discourse actually has a lot of intellectual respectability today in the West. And so we've forgotten these other histories of humiliation, of assertion, and indeed this history in which Japan becomes a very important power, a country to learn from for a range of Asian peoples. So my intention in writing this book was to excavate some of this history, which is lost to, I would dare say, to most of us. Whether you're someone like myself, an Indian national who spent most of his life in India, growing up on a particular kind of history, or if you're like my wife, who's a British national, or indeed if you're an American or if you're an Egyptian, because our nationalist histories really do not accommodate these more cosmopolitan histories of intellectual exchange, of people learning, people within Asia looking at other Asian countries. We know of people looking at the West, Asians looking at Western Europe and the United States and learning from them or copying them or imitating them. But we really do not know of this very vibrant cosmopolitan public sphere that opened up in Asia in the late 19th century and became more and more vibrant in the early 20th century. So my intention was to describe that this particular moment in the history of modern Asia, where you had people traveling, people learning from each other, exchanging visions, exchanging ideas about how to combat this enormous challenge of Western power and how we could, learn from each other, how we could actually also maybe come together. And this is also the beginning of, for many people, the beginning of Pan-Asianism, which we now tend to associate almost entirely with the misbegotten project in the Second World War to sort of for the prosperity sphere, but actually it's a much more complicated and tangled history, and the fact that many Asians themselves subscribe to it. Some of the most distinguished writers and intellectuals, even someone like Rabindranath Tagore, India's great, one of India's greatest poets, Nobel laureate, he was a great believer in Pan-Asianism, in the way he conceived Pan-Asianism. So all these particular histories which have been obscured, which have been suppressed or ignored or neglected, that was partly my intention to bring them to light, but also illuminate the situation in which we find ourselves today, where the assumptions of Western power, for instance, which have really guided our worldviews for a very long time, even if you were someone like me growing up in India, most of the worldviews that we have, particularly of countries like Japan or China, they're very much a product of the American system, of the American intellectual industry. So it's only very recently that we started looking at our neighbors, looking at other Asian countries, and starting to have our independent outlooks and independent visions. So a lot of what happens in the world today comes as a shock to us. It's deeply bewildering, whether it's the rise of Islamic, political Islam in large parts of the Muslim world, whether it's the rise of state capitalism in China. All of these events are becoming more and more difficult to decipher if you're looking at it from the perspective of Western Europe and United States. If you're a believer, for instance, in modernization theory, on thinking, eventually we'll have democracy in these places, and these are all hiccups, and political Islam is an aberration. You look at a country like Turkey, where Islam was formally disestablished, was indeed violently eradicated for a while, and political Islam has made a big comeback there in Turkey, and unleashing a whole lot of socio-economic, cultural changes in that society. We see now the rise of political Islam in, of course, countries that have just emerged from military dictatorships, Egypt and Tunisia. So all of these events, which should not really be so confusing and bewildering, but because we look at them with certain assumptions, with the assumption that these countries, these societies, are going to resemble Western Europe or United States, that they're all converging on this particular model of modernity. And this vision is almost entirely uninformed by any sense of history. So we end up really being very bewildered by all of these events. And I think if you go back and look at what was happening in these countries, intellectually or politically, who were the figures at that time formulating a response to Western power? Who were the figures forming political movements, educating the general public, writing in the newspapers, publishing books? Who were the first figures? Because this is a time when, whether you look at Turkey or Egypt or China or Japan, you see in all of these countries the first attempts to address a larger public by writers, by journalists, by intellectuals, the first attempts to form maybe not political parties, but some sort of voluntary associations. This is the beginning of essentially nationalist movements, of mass political movements. This is the creation of public spheres in all of these countries, all happening, starting 1870s onwards. And unless we understand that period, unless we understand the particular challenges faced by individuals in countries like India or China or Turkey and Egypt, I don't think we can really understand where we are today. We cannot really understand their particular national trajectories. We cannot understand what is happening in these places. To simply assume that these societies, no matter what their histories are going to look like us. By us, I mean Western Europe or United States. It sounds like the worst form of narcissism, but in a way, this is actually most of what our assumptions have amounted to in the last 20, 30 years, whether it's the end of history thesis or whether it's the clash of civilization. They all sort of emerge from this expectation that the rest of the world should, if it isn't, then should really be converging on this particular model. It has very little regard for these very specific histories. So I think one part of the book was trying to address this particular ignorance among policymakers and opinion makers. But there was another side of it, which was that I felt that some of the debates, some of the ideas that were thrown up in the late 19th century by Chinese intellectuals or Muslim intellectuals, their fear that Western power or Western politics, Western forms of economy, they posed an existential challenge to many of these more tradition-minded agrarian societies of Asia. That they involved a kind of radical overthrow and overhauling of their societies that would really, well, not only involve a great deal of violence, but create a trauma that would last for decades and decades afterwards. And they were right, most of them, that modernization in so many parts of Asia has involved a lot of violence, whether it's China, whether it's Taiwan, or indeed India. And this these very specific fears and premonitions people like Rabindranath Tagore had, or Liang Qichao in China, most of which have been vindicated today. I think it's important to look at those fears, look at those particular analyses of, say, Western capitalism, and the idea of the human individual as was encoded in the idea of Western capitalism, of the human individual pursuing self-interest, being motivated by self-interest, and this whole sort of epistemology that was part of the package of Western capitalism and imperialism, which so many Asians felt as a really deep challenge to their own ways of life. I think it's really important to go back and look at those again, because so many of the crises that these Asians foretold and foresaw are now with us in manifold forms: environmental, political, military, and I think in many ways their ideas and their debates, their challenges, even their confusions can be a very rich resource today for understanding this sort of larger crisis we are in today, which is moral and spiritual as much as political and economic, because when we talk about the shift of power from the West to the East, we are really dealing with the subject in an extremely superficial way, because what does this power shift really amount to? Who is it shifting to, and in what way, and what kind of power is this? Are we really seriously considering that 2.6 billion people in India and China are going to be consuming in the same way that a few 100 million people in Europe and America have so far? Are they going to be living at the same sort of level of affluence, of consumerism that a few 100 million Europeans and Americans have monopolized for a while? The answer is very clearly no, because for the first time we now have, in the last half century or so, a new critic of these modern political economic arrangements, which is simply planet Earth, which is nature, which is clearly telling us that this is unsustainable. This kind of, these models of political economic growth, this is simply not going to work out for a majority of the world's population. And yet here we are, still pursuing, still enshrining these models nationally within our respective societies, and almost sort of sleepwalking through history, even though all kinds of crises are erupting all around us, and political leaders are simply in the business of basically containing violence, containing unrest. They can't really think very far ahead at this point, the elites, the ruling elites of India and China. And I think that's where these early critiques of Western style modernity in places like India and China become important. And I think we have to return to that. So one of the intentions behind this book was to throw light on some of these ideas and some of these debates. There were other intentions too, but I think I'm going to stop now because I'm using up far too much time and open it up to questions.
Good. Well, it's a free country and a free university, so feel free to ask any questions.
I'll take advantage of the controlling the mic and the fact that possession is 9/10 of the law. A very Western concept, probably. to make it two short questions. One is, we always hear about the Battle of Tsushima. What was the impact of the Battle of Adowa on Asia? The Adowa, when the Abyssinians defeated the Italians, really the first defeat, I think, in modern post-industrial revolution of a modern Western European state by an African one, I mean by a non-Western one.
There were a couple of poems written about that, but it wasn't as big as that because the Italians were really not known to be great warriors in the first instance. I'm sorry if I'm
But
offending.
the Russians weren't known as being great sailors.
They were not known as great sailors, but they had a really powerful, I mean, at least on surface, they had a powerful, and they had been harassing, and they were in an expansionist mode at that point, and so that was much more important. But there were quite a lot of Indians enthused by the Abyssinian victory, and so it definitely had an impact, but not nearly the same as the Japanese.
And then I'll ask a second short question. This is a very short question. Is
You've mentioned the impact on the Asian world, ranging from South Asia to East Asia, of Battle of Tsushima, feeling that as non-Westerners, non-whites, they were, which was indeed the case, being colonized and looked down upon, and in many cases assaulted by Europeans and later North Americans. The interesting thing, and this obviously brings us to the 21st century, very often when you live in Japan and you are, as I am, a Western European American white person, you feel that life is very nice here, but you think people are more polite, or more helpful to you than if you were Japanese. You go to a store and life is very nice. I mean, there's one exception, it's Davide Rubito, who's a white Japanese who always complains about discrimination, but I mean, when I think of the list of people who are victims of prejudice in this planet, I mean, whites in Japan don't strike me as being on the top list of the most persecuted people. But when you talk to East Asians about their experiences in being in Japan, they're often very different. I mean, I remember we were at a meeting we organized with the Chinese, and we asked one of our Chinese friends whether it was true that he felt that as an Asian he was not treated as well as a white person. I mean, I put it in racial terms, because obviously if you're Asian American, you're Western, but you're seen as an Asian because you look Asian. And he said, yeah, obviously. He said, obviously we're looked down upon compared to white people. So how does this transformation occur?
Amongst...
well, in Japan, how do we move from this thing of we're all victims of the West to, well, the Westerners are actually better than our fellow Asians?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I suppose I would have to spend more time here to figure that one out. I think one of the things that was lost, and because, a lot of people, to go back to Tsushima briefly, a lot of people really didn't have the information about the immediate context of the Russo-Japanese War, and the fact that Japan was a British ally and had concluded a big treaty with Britain at that point. So this whole different, even though Japan's victory was seen as a great racial advance for the non-white races, but the fact that the victory had happened was partly made possible by an alliance with a white power. That was a nuance that was widely lost. So there are always these kinds of confusions and misperceptions that drive history, and I think they are very much. It's not the correct visions that are driving history, but there are always the kind of misinformed or underinformed notions, whether it's racial solidarity or whether it's just very particular pieces of information that will form a picture that's far too subtle or complex for anyone to understand. So you go for what you think happened, or what is the right meaning for me at that particular point. So even afterwards, I mean, I think the fact that Japan was slowly becoming an expansionist power, that news arrived very late in various parts of Asia. I mean, I think if you asked an Egyptian in the 1920s, what is happening in Korea or what's happening in China in the 1930s, they would have no idea. They sort of clung to an older idea that Japan was the savior, and that idea then re-emerged during the Second World War. For a lot of Asians, that it became. So the whole sort of racial thing, that sort of was kept alive by the fact that there wasn't enough information coming in that people weren't really aware that so much else had happened after 1905, and that different forms of racial hierarchies had been erected also across Asia.
Pankaj, thank you very much for coming and your talk. I have to say, it's a brilliant excavation of that lost history, and your description of the transnational networks of intellectuals crossing the borders is superbly done. I want to ask you a bit about the second part of the book, and you seem deeply disappointed in Asia, that you chart the rise of Asia, and at one point I think describe it something like the revenge against the West, and then immediately turn to, but there's this stunning intellectual failure. And at the very end of, I mean, you sort of basically have a withering assessment of modern India, of modern China, and you end your book rather darkly. So I just wanted you to respond in a sense to your disappointments and how you might trace that to the pre-war movements that you described.
I think, I mean, I just suppose a sense of disappointment comes from the fact that, first of all, it's rather grand to be disappointed by Asia. I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde when he first arrived in the United States, and he was asked what he thought of the Atlantic Ocean, and he said it was very disappointing. But I think, I mean, if one were to pinpoint one, say, reason for this, why so much of Asia today seems to be repeating the same mistakes that have been made by various Western countries over the last century and a half, is because there seems to be left no alternative way of thinking about how are we going to make, say, life viable, attractive, happy for 1.2 billion Indians, apart from the fact, let's put them in a house with 2 garages and make them wear t-shirts and jeans and maybe, you know, get them to work in a factory or an office. That vision, which has really informed our respective modernities across Asia, which is simply unsustainable. Even it's unsustainable at this point. You know, you can't get that many people from the villages into the big cities. You can't produce, even today you can't produce you know, even sufficient jobs for the people who are coming into the job market right now. You don't have enough power to supply to Indian cities and Indian towns. And these problems, some of these problems are insurmountable. You know, there's nothing you can do about them. So how did we get launched on this project of, you know, creating a form of modernity that resembles that form of modernity that was achieved by Western Europe under very special circumstances in the 19th century, when they could go and conquer just about every continent that existed. You could, you know, you had these wide open spaces, you could, you know, access all these resources. There wasn't much opposition to you because you were militarily superior to all the peoples you encountered, and you could build up, you know, your societies, your very small societies in Western Europe and then America, and you could accumulate these massive advantages over everyone else. So you won that particular race to be modern, and then everyone else has been forced to run in this race, and in this race in which the West becomes the sort of, you know, the arbiter and also the person pulling the trigger, and off you go, and then there's someone's also strung the sort of a tape at the other end and saying, he's come first, or he's leading. So Japan was was obviously had won the race early on, but it turns out Japan did not really win the race, or it won the race in a very different way altogether, which was not acceptable to Western powers. And now India and China are leading this particular race, and China is ahead, and we know what the consequences of that for not just China's neighbors, who are very worried about the possibility of war, but also for the billions of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese, what it means for them, politically or environmentally, to be, you know, dragged into this particular race to modernity. So I think the fact that we haven't really, formulated any kind of viable alternative to this kind of national development, this kind of economic growth, which involves appropriation, expropriation, which involves conquest, which involves getting other people's resources, either through straightforward imperialism or through various kind of dubious trade deals, and we see that happening as we speak in Africa. The Africans are starting to complain about the Indians and the Chinese striking dubious deals there with various dictators, or simply not caring about the wishes of the local population. We see the same script, that we saw in the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century with the rise of Japan. And why can't we deviate from that script? I mean, that's where the disappointment is. As that, why are we hell-bent upon repeating this extremely violent history?
I said this is the most intellectually dynamic group in the world, so those who ask questions will have to give less money because we allow voting. So that's not my motive.
The U.S. government has recently stated this kind of policy of, well, originally they stated it as a pivot to Asia, now they're calling it a rebalance or a balance to Asia. Do you see any parallels or differences or mixture of those between what happened in 1905 and what's happening now, this refocus, if you will, on Asia, at least on the part of the view of the U.S.? And of course, this involves many countries in Asia with, let's say, the TPP agreements.
I think, it would be probably unwise to make historical analogies with that particular period. But from a broader perspective, the fact that a major Asian country is now staking its claim to be modern, it's making the same kind of claims upon the world's resources, upon, essentially, it's taking a kind of claim to power that Japan made in the early 20th century. I think there could be a broad comparison to be made there, except that China is a much bigger country with a much larger population, and the fact that it has a wider, broader presence within Asia already. So again, there are differences there, but I think the policy essentially, again, of containing China, of striking trade deals with Asian countries that very deliberately exclude China, I just don't think these are meant to produce peace in the region in the long term, because this is, again, as I said, this is the same script all over again, is that an industrializing country that badly needs resources, commodities, is very hungry, doesn't really have many commodities or resources or energy resources in particular of its own, and will seek them wherever it can find them, and is indeed prepared to, create naval bases right up to all the way to the Persian Gulf. If it has to do that, it will do that. All of this is just setting up the stage for some other unpleasant confrontation, some other military confrontation. The problem is that, all these resources are finite. This is what we've now come up with. Back in the 20th century, they didn't look like that way. But now we can now see the future. We can now predict the future slightly more accurately, and we know that there will be conflict ahead if this kind of brinkmanship, this kind of competition for resources, for economic spheres, for economic interests, if this goes on in this way, then we're just heading towards military conflict of some kind or other. And also resources, again, India also wants a piece of that. So it's not just one country, which was the case in the early 20th century. It's now two major countries with large populations making their claims as industrializing powers. So the prospect for conflict is even greater now. And we're not even talking about conflicts within these nation states. At this point, we're only talking about conflicts between nation states, and we know the conflicts that are raging in different parts of India today, or the kind of unrest that is manifested in China in these tens of thousands of demonstrations, and practically every day there's something major happening in China today. The kind of dissatisfaction and discontent people feel with the way the economies are progressing and the serious inequalities that are developing. So even leaving that aside, I think this is not a very promising scenario we're looking at.
Thank you. I haven't yet read your book, but I'm looking eagerly forward to doing so. But I'd like to comment on the initial part of your talk today and suggest something to you which may be in the book. A lot of discussion, of course, of intellectual interplay, in this case, intra-Asia interplay. Some of the work I've done myself looks at a different aspect of this, which is art and artistic interplay. Rabindranath Tagore, he went to China twice, if I'm not mistaken. He said he came to Japan twice. He brought Japanese artists back with him. When he founded his own university at Chantilly, the central part was, in fact, the faculty of art, not of arts in terms of literature and so on, but actually of art. And I wonder if this is a dimension which we also, I don't know if you're able to comment on this, really, that a great deal of that intra-Asia cultural contact was in fact at a different level, which perhaps doesn't really get caught by the analysis of what intellectuals were talking and writing about. Many artists didn't actually write anything. But substantial interplay was in fact occurring. And that interplay was also slightly paradoxical in the sense that the British were founding art schools in India, but then the Indian artists who were passing through those schools were using that artistic training as a kind of, in some cases, a kind of alternative modernism or some anti-modernism themselves. What about that dimension? Should we draw in that dimension of some equal status to what you probably talk about in the book, which I haven't read?
Absolutely. Actually, I don't talk about that as much as I would have liked to. But you're very right in saying that was a hugely important dimension. And it's interesting that most of these exchanges were really taking place through the same networks of communication that had been set up by people like Tagore. And you could argue that a major tendency in Indian modern art was inaugurated by the connection with Japan. That a whole very important component of modern Indian art would not exist today if it wasn't for the connection with Japan. Okakura in particular, and that whole school and the sort of regular network, regular exchanges that Tagore and Okakura set up, and people visiting each other's countries, and Abhindranath Tagore going to Japan. No, it's hugely important, again, of how modernism, or a particular form of Asian modernism, really emerged out of this sort of contact with Chinese and most importantly Japanese art at that point. So that's also an area that's really relatively underexplored. I mean, at least when we talk about intellectual exchanges, we tend to exclude that particular bit. But it did really happen within the same kind of networks. And as you know, Tagore, when he went to China, he had painters in his part of his entourage, and they were with him all the time. And he was constantly having discussions with Japanese, and he had personal friends among Japanese artists. So they were constantly talking about art. It was not always politics. Although at that point it was very difficult to separate art from politics. It was all part of a larger quest to define a nationalist sensibility, and art was very much often used as a means to foster and encourage a kind of nationalist sensibility, not narrowly nationalist, but also something that was cosmopolitan. And Pan-Asianism was very important there. Pan-Asianism, which drew upon older Asian networks of religion, the fact that Buddhism traveled from India to China, to Korea, and then finally to Japan. These were very important facts for these people, and they were trying to work with them and to see whether there is some sort of cultural unity to be observed in Asia, in the Asia of that time.
If I can follow up on this, you've talked about the influence of art. We had one of our colleagues who used to teach at university pointed out, she gave a presentation on Japanese art, and she said that in Japan, when you talk about art, you're either talking about Japanese art, as one does in any country, it's national art, and then you really talked about Western art. And that there's relatively little here about non-Western, non-Japanese art. And I think it's something you can see in terms of space devoted to museums. You know, if you take the subway here, you often see ads for art exhibits. And it's generally, the great collections from the Metropolitan Museum in New York.
Collections of Western art. Oh, okay, well, I guess yeah, I don't know what happened, but I seem to have been censored.
Often the museums in Europe. But there's very little, and it's something even you see symbolically. I think this is the first time in Japan. If you might notice in Tokyo very often buildings are given names. And when they're given names, they're often given Western names. I have a friend who lives in a building. It's called the Chambord, like the French castle. Sometimes the British names, but I've never seen a building called the Great Wall or the Great Buddha or something. I mean, they are great artistic monuments in Asia. So why? How do you look at this evolution? And I have also a question linked to this: is this the case in other Asian countries? I mean, would it be the case in China? Is in China art either Chinese art or Western art? Or what about India? You mentioned the influence of Japanese art. What is it today? Thanks.
Thank you. That's actually, I mean, I've
I think this has been
in the last, just in the last 3 days I've been here, I've been kind of thinking about that a lot, about how Asia seems to be absent in Japan. That I've not had this experience in any other country in this part of the world. China, for instance, there is, very clearly an attempt to think about Asia, partly because the overseas Chinese are everywhere, and overseas Chinese have been so important in the last 20 years in China. So it's hard to not think about Thailand or Singapore or Indonesia in the context of China. Same in Indonesia, same in Thailand. It's very difficult to be unaware of Asia or the other parts of Asia while you're there. But in Japan, Asia really does feel strangely absent. Even I was telling Jeff about my visit to the Yasukani Shrine today and the museum there. And it seemed to me even the Pan-Asian aspect was relatively played down, which struck me as surprising, that aspect where many Asians actually acknowledged that it was Japan which was really, partly, if not largely, instrumental in liberating their countries from Western rule, from Western domination, that aspect had not been sufficiently covered at the museum. So even, a very legitimate aspect or an aspect that most people could talk about uncontroversially in Japan was not there. But also I think, I feel when people asked me when I was traveling and said, why have you not written about post-war Japan in your book, although you do talk about post-war Turkey or post-war Egypt or post-war Iran. And I had to say that post-war Japan, in a way, did what was, in fact, asked of Japan in the late 19th century, which is to turn your back on Asia and to embrace the West. Is that it has, in a way, floated away, it's drifted away from Asia. So it's very difficult to make it part of a larger trajectory, post-war trajectory, that it had a very unique, a very specific national development, which really set it apart from the rest of Asia, from what happened there. So despite being this great beacon for Asia for much of the first half of the 20th century, 1905 and then 1945, at the end of 1945, Japan, even though defeated, had actually, had succeeded in getting the Europeans out of Asia, and after that, it really doesn't feature in our imagination anymore. It doesn't form part of any kind of larger political, ideological, or intellectual. This is a curious, a very curious sort of development, and I need to understand more about it. But it's certainly very striking, given how important Japan was for much of the first half of the 20th century.
Well, of course, when Japan modernized, the slogan was "Leave Asia." Leave Asia, join Europe. So I think that, to some extent, is the same thing as if Asians look to, and you could argue that Ataturk too was "Leave Asia, join Europe," and you could argue that Mao Zedong. Was leaving. I don't know whether he was joining Europe, but he was surely leaving.
So the interesting thing about the Turks is that they have actually returned to Asia, and we now have talk of Neo-Ottomanism, and now they're forming links with all the Asian countries around them. So after flirting with a European destiny for itself, they've realized that that's not going to work out, so they've come back to Asia.
So that's still a trajectory you could talk about in connection with what happened in the early 20th century or late 19th century.
Are you commenting?
I don't think so, no.
I think you can just hold it a bit. Yeah, sure. Oh, you finished?
I am.
Okay, then we'll take the. Yeah. And Oto-san and then Tato-san. Yeah, if you can ask Oto-san and then Sato-san. We'll bring you the mic, but I think you'll probably have to speak without the mic.
You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you. You're professors.
Let me just ask. You're talking about Asia versus or in Western modernity. That's how you frame this. And you are sort of earning and wanting some Asian sort of set of values to challenge or improve on the present condition.
No.
Let me just.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, modernity, I mean, if you reduce modernity, there are three pillars. Capitalism is its paymaster. Liberalism is its ideology. And the state is the highest form of social organization. These are the three pillars. Asia, non-West, have all bought into this to one degree or the other. Right? Now, the crisis of modernity is not because Asia is becoming more Western. It's also modernity is in crisis in the West in terms of liberalism, capitalism, and state control. You can see it in Europe. You can see it in the U.S. So then, going back, my question is, does Asia have any other ideas to rival or to improve upon these three pillars of the state, capitalism, and liberalism? And unless Asia has these things with something to offer, we can't challenge or really talk intelligently about modernity. Not money.
Yes, I mean, I think the confusing bit is when you start. Thank you.
Associating, or you start using the word either Asian or Western before values, for instance. I mean, modernity, of course, has a very specific origin in the practices, ideological, economic, political, that emerged in Western Europe, early 19th century, the ones you described, capitalism, liberalism, and the form of the nation state. And these are then generalized around the world, either imposed or people end up voluntarily embracing them, as in this country, in order to survive in this new world, dog-eat-dog world of competitive nation states. So you end up basically following the same model that the West developed in its own rise to world power. And even, I mean, this is, I say this in my book, even someone like Gandhi, you know, who's a great critic of the Western model of modernity, a very, very savage critic. And even he turns into a nationalist at some point because he realizes that you have to have a nation state, a sovereign nation state, before you can think of anything else. But the problem is, once you buy into one part of the package, you have to then buy into everything else. If you have a nation state, then you have to start industrializing in order to achieve some kind of industrial strength, military strength. Otherwise, you'll be overwhelmed. And then, what's the best way to industrialize? Is it socialism or is it capitalism? So in the end, we all decide that it's capitalism that's going to do it. So little by little, we are bought into the entire package. And what then for any other alternatives or any other ideas? This is where we are right now. That, you know, slowly in the last 65 years, 67 years of Indian independence, we've seen us go from being a very idealistic post-colonial nation state with, you know, great deal of energy and dynamism and thinking about how can we build India into something different. How can we have that as a moral example for everyone else? But living in the world that we have, we've ended up making decisions. And all of us, it's not just India, but China, and China's had a more traumatic path towards this outcome. But we've all ended up adopting particular bits and pieces. To the end, we bought the entire package. And here we are with this dilemma of how do you get 2.6 billion people? How do you give them what you promised them, which is this utopia of Western consumerist capitalism, which is also last 20, 25 years now is available, or seems to be available to everyone because of the revolution in communications and so on. So many more expectations, many more aspirations out there to be appeased, to be satisfied, to be fulfilled. And so that's when you have to then, I mean, also environmental constraints, which I mentioned earlier. So if you're thinking now of, are there alternatives to this? Are there ideas that we can sort of, you know, use to critique this model or to develop a new alternative? I think the first step, however ineffective these ideas might seem in practice, the first step is certainly to look at some of these people in the late 19th century, early 20th century were saying. Even in Japan, there was, as you know much better than anyone here in this room, there was people critiquing modernity and thinking of how we sort of find ways to overcome it or come up with new ideas. And that impetus, that movement, it certainly disappeared from the mainstream cultures of our societies. You know, if you look at academia, if you look at journalism, if you look at newspapers, they've all basically, you know, regurgitating the same arguments, which are basically about fine-tuning. How can we, you know, make this slightly better? How can we contain the kind of unrest created by this model? It's not really about thinking, actually, this model is unsustainable, it's unviable, it's unworkable. So this is, I mean, what I was trying to do with this book is actually to you know, create some sort of interest in these people who were dismissed as backward or cranks, or you know, in the case of Tagore, who was brutally dismissed in Japan, also in China at that time, for his critique of the nation state and of nationalism, to make that interesting and relevant and pertinent again, because otherwise we're just in this impasse with no real guidance. And you know, as you say, the crisis of modernity is also manifest in the West itself, where you've had a period of unprecedented expansion, and now, you know, people faced, at least in Western Europe, if not in America, faced with the prospect of irreversible decline. Large parts of Western Europe are facing that, and you know, they've come out. Even countries like, you know, you go to a place like Spain, or you go to a place like Ireland, where 20 years ago you didn't really have modern economy in large parts of the country. And the last 20 years, they've all bought into this illusion that they're all going to be fantastically, you know, modern and consume everything from all around the world, and they can just keep doing it endlessly, and ended up in this very sad and sorry state that they are in right now. And there's no way out of it. So the delusion is not just common in Asia. It's in also very much a delusion that millions of people, tens of millions of people in the West have bought. And here they are, lumbered with this, and we just don't know how to get out of it. You know, we've given up so much. We've sort of overthrown and eradicated so many of our traditional lifestyles, or ideas of contentment, ideas of happiness, for the sake of this, you know, this whole project of becoming modern and becoming happy and becoming content through modernity. And what are most of us left with? And this is in the end, I mean, I think it comes down to, behind these social political crises, there are larger metaphysical questions lurking there. I mean, the kind of questions that people have asked themselves for a long time, the kind of questions people like Tagore were asking, which is, what is the good life? You know, what is the human individual here to do? And what will bring him or her true contentment? Is it through the accumulation of material goods? Is it through organizing yourself into nation states, waging wars, you know, scrambling for resources in different parts of the world? What is behind all this? So those are the questions we are now still, you know, these are the questions we are confronting after a long period of delusion. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
After hearing about your lecture today, I'd like to say just a small thing, that I, as an ordinary citizen of Japan, at the age 66 this year, when I look at the Asian countries and its highest speed of the growth, Japan has been so fortunate, magically fortunate, that we have enjoyed so far. The glorious war, victory of the Japan-Russo War, complete victory and then complete loss at 1945. Then Japan has recovered well. So I think there is something in it, is my eternal, you know, theme to learn. I'm still learning about the Japanese history. And the good thing about it is that as long as I read everything, the history of Japan in Japanese, we have a huge pile of documents and books available. The miracle number one is continuity of Japanese history, no breakage at all. While Asian histories, I have a lot of difficulties. So much, just one English translated version is only available, and that's the only one I can learn. 2, foreign aid programs. Although we have the big capital and growth or a GDP, we have limited resources of English speaking. That's another thing that you have. Indian population, English speaking, or the Philippines, right now the population close to 100 million is the center of foreign language schools. So why don't you best utilize English speaking people to educate Chinese or Japanese or larger population or high GDP nations? Then that is the direct contact of the cross-culture or intercultural learning stage that you can open up for yourself. What do you think?
I agree, but I think we need serious immigration reform in this country before we can let the Indians and the Chinese coming into teaching. It's a very good idea. I think I mean, I'm surprised by how few English speakers there are in Japan. Obviously, there's not much history there. I mean, in India, there's always been, you know, it's 200 years old now, the presence of English in that country. But I thought there was a very long period of Anglophilia in Japan, and that would have created a strong English-speaking tradition, but that's not the case, clearly.
So not enough English speakers. Well, come to TUJ. TUJ is a great place to improve your English. You say this to 120 million Japanese, not to people here, but everybody here is English speaking.
I think the introduced me at the beginning. I'm Siegfried Wieler, freelancer journalist from Germany. So what every time it astonished me, and I didn't really understand the idea. It was the idea of Pan-Asianism or nationalism. How was it translated in Asian countries? And because I think this kind of a pan, it's a very European idea. It's based on an idea of unity. And nation is also based on an idea of unity. So, but in Asia, there is not this kind of unity. Every nations look like Indonesia. There are so many ethnicities. There is no nation, no unity. So how can this concept brought to Asia? How can it, or is it? I think, can it function in Asia? If you look, perhaps last example of not functioning was Hatayama, former Prime Minister Hatayama's idea of Asian community. It's based on a European thinking. It's very difficult to translate in Asia. How can this European concept function in Asia, or can it not function in Asia?
I mean, I agree with you. I think the huge differences between the European experience and the Asian experience. For one, Europe had something that Asia's lacked always, which is one coherent religion, which gave it a kind of cultural unity, and language, and the Roman Empire. I mean, there's so many things that constitute a shared experience for large parts of Western Europe. So when we talk about European culture, European literature, all of us have some sense of what that means or what traditions, whereas the Asian thing seems invented. And one has to remember, I mean, Asia is a Western invention, it's a European invention, which Asians themselves then adopted, political purposes, strategic purposes, and then tried to build into something that could resemble, or that could maybe made to look like Europe or European community or Asian community. So it always looks a bit unpersuasive and unconvincing. Because its uses are primarily political and strategic. So even in the late 19th century, if you look at what, you know, where did people like Tagore or even Okakura for that matter, where were they getting these ideas from? A lot of these ideas were being generated by European Orientalist scholars at that point about Asia, about Asia's unity. I mean, the whole discovery of Buddhism happened under the auspices of European scholarship. But you know, that doesn't undermine the political, you know, importance to many people at that point in the late 19th century of positing that particular notion. The same with, you know, Pan-Islamism, a variant of Pan-Asianism. You know, why did the Ottomans think of this at this point? It's because they themselves felt oppressed by what they saw as this kind of unity among the European powers. When they wanted to oppress the Ottoman Empire, they all came together. Pan-Slavism, which was a concept they encountered because of the Russian insistence on, you know, dealing, you know, pretty harshly with the Ottoman insistence on protecting their minorities within the Ottoman Empire, using those minorities as a pretext to get concessions out of Istanbul. So out of these varied experiences, they thought, if these people can, deal with these or create these convenient panisms, why can't we also invoke pan-Islamism? So it's very much a response to what they felt was this, united nations, united society, united countries, all coming together and banding together against the Ottomans. And I think the Pan-Asian thing also really emerged as a kind of response to the combined might of Western powers, European powers in Asia at that point, that we could also all come together, and here is the basis of our unity. You could find Buddhism or maritime trade, or there are any number of, if you start really looking deep into history, you could invoke any number of intellectual exchanges, migrating religions, trade networks, to say, well, this area was all once bound together by this and this and this. But I think it is an artificial construct. So one has to recognize that when one talks about it.
Yes.
Well, I fully agree with you that the word Asia or Asian is a very, very artificial thing which we were looking at from Europe and which we created even perhaps out of Europe. I think there is an even bigger difference between Japan and mainland Asia. Even in mainland Asia, I wonder, you're being Indian, how many of your people in India consider themselves to be Asian, and how many are thinking, no, we are Indians, and the same is, of course, true for China. But coming back to Japan, because I have been a long time in Japan, I mean, Japan, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, considered themselves, partially as a result of having won their wars against China, against Russia, they considered themselves to be superior to other Asians. And when they were defeated again by a Western power, again the feeling came up that, well, it's the Western world which is on top of the world. And after the war, and I'm here since 1960, Japan never took Asia as a kind of a target for its recovery. The whole recovery was based on reaching Western standards, US standards, European standards, and by the end of the 1980s, well, Japan, there was this famous book by Ezra Vogel, Japan is #1. That's when Japan started its 2 sleeping decades, because there was no other target available anymore. Japan was satisfied they had reached the Western level, and somehow were starting to drift along, as we all know by now. So the idea of Japan being Asian is a pretty new concept, and of course it is coming into play now because Japan can no longer disregard Asia from many different aspects, particularly of course China or even Korea. But again, also Korea, I mean, I was in Korea many times, so a Korean would never consider himself to be an Asian. He's a Korean, and the nationalistic part of many countries in Asia is to their state, to their country, rather than to Asia as a whole. And in that context, I have some difficulties to go along with your philosophy, but I try to understand it. Thank you.
It's a philosophy, not mine. It's a philosophy that made a lot of sense in the early 20th century to a lot of intelligent people before nation states had been formed in large parts of Asia. So even someone like Nehru in 1940, he's really thinking about an Asian federation. Someone like Ho Chi Minh, there was a letter that he wrote to Indonesian leaders in 1945 saying we should all, come together as part of a larger federation. They're similar. These were not just people set up by the Japanese to talk like that, but people independently, thinking about. I mean, Pan-Asianism was a proper political force. No matter how artificial its construction was or how, shallowly rooted it might have been in history. But it was an idea, it was a concept that a lot of people believed in very seriously for a very long time too. So that was in the first half of the 20th century. Now, today, 2013, you have 60, 70 years of nation states across Asia where you've had generations growing up on particular nationalist histories, different sense of identity altogether. So now of course it's impossible for them to think of belonging to a larger Asian sphere. They all belong to particular nation states and they owe allegiance to their particular nationalist histories, their particular sense of identity. So it's becoming more and more difficult for them to conceptualize this notion of Asia. And it's revived, of course, in various economic forums and various kind of bilateral relationships. It's often invoked. But that's what its role is today. I mean, I don't think it should be taken seriously beyond the point. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying, there was a time when it was important, but now its invocations are mostly rhetorical. And it's really economic self-interest or national economic interests that are behind these invocations of the Asian community or various trade partnerships.
Mark, and then Jeff.
Curious to know, how would you see the importance of religion in Asia? You see, well, we have Buddhist Asia, Hinduist Asia, and Muslim Asia. Is it decreasing or increasing in terms of importance? And what it's meaning in terms of, redefining either modernity or either while being a force to change something?
I think, it's hard to generalize across such a broad swath of territory, but if one were to make any kind of general statement about it, it would be that the older expectation that religion is something that gets progressively relegated to the private sphere, that gets removed from public life as societies become more secular, more modern, and more democratic, that expectation has proven to be completely wrong in large parts of Asia. So it's in fact quite the contrary. The more prosperous people become, the more devout they become in India or in Turkey or in Iran or Egypt, or indeed in Java. So I think religion is going to continue to play a really important role, not only in the private lives of many peoples in these countries, but also in the public sphere. I mean, especially a religion like Islam, which has a broader political vision. It has a vision of justice. It has a vision of fairness and equity. And I think it's going to be continuously invoked by people, by political parties, by individuals, especially when they are confronted with dictatorships. And this has proven to be the case again and again across the Muslim world. So I think those sort of earlier notions that religion is on the decline and that is something we are all going to be rid of. Those were completely widely wrong. Those ideas. It's very much here. It's assuming different forms. Religion is being globalized. It's becoming more popular, more folk, but it's definitely not going away.
Jeff, and then the back. Brief, where are we approaching the limits? So brevity is the sort of way.
Okay. I think one of the reasons you were talking about how the rest of Asia casts a very tiny shadow of Japan, I think perhaps looking at the Cold War and how that divided Asia, sort of prolonged the post-war period, the divisions that happened during the war. I think that in 2007, Japan tried to create something called the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity. And that was to join the nations of common values that all seemed to be a string encircling China. And one big missing link of that chain, which shared Japan's democratic values and capitalism and all that, was South Korea. And so I happened to be chatting to somebody from the foreign ministry here. I said, oh, well, it's curious. How come South Korea isn't in this arc of freedom and prosperity? And he said very deadpan, they didn't ask. So you say that the rest of Asia casts a small shadow here, but my sense is Japan casts a very large shadow all over the rest of Asia. I mean, you see AKB48 pop group in Indonesia, you see Doraemon all over Asia. Japan's soft power seems to be strong. Japan still is an inspiration. Are many Asians inspired by the Chinese model, by the Indian model? I mean, I still think that Japan still is offering a lot of inspiration to Asia. I just want to...
I completely agree. I mean, I think this is the piquant fact I've been kind of pondering over the last 3 days, is because Japan has been a huge factor in my life, has been a huge presence, and in the lives of many Asians, many people, many Indians I know. And yet there seems to be no awareness of that here, or no, at least not manifest, not visibly there, in the sense that the kind of soft power it has exercised, not through just its cars or its electronic items, but in India, there's so much charitable work done by Japanese foundations. Whenever you go to a Buddhist site, most of the major buildings there have been created by Japanese charity. Japanese roads, some of the best roads in India, in Bihar, for instance, were made with Japanese collaboration. And these facts are known. Even if you ask a sort of rickshaw driver, they would be able to tell you that was Japan that was responsible. They would not be able to name too many Asian countries, but they would know it was Japan. For civil society, Japan's rejection of nuclear weapons, in 1998, I remember during the nuclear tests, Japan's disapproval and very angry, rejection of the nuclear tests was a huge source of strength for many anti-nuclear activists in India at that point, and in Pakistan at that point. So at very many different levels, whether it's governmental or NGOs or human rights organizations, Japan is always is a player, is an actor, is an important actor. I think, but that, as you said, the relationship it's a case of unrequited affection. And also we're not even talking about how so many East Asian economies benefited a great deal from early Japanese investments in those countries and Japanese aid, or even China for that matter, in the early stages of its capitalist expansion. There was a lot of Japanese assistance there. So I think it's important to recall those histories when we talk about Japan and Asia today and its connections with Asia, because they are actually, they have been around for a long time and are remembered by people across Asia, but strangely enough not part of the mainstream recollection or sense of, mainstream sense of Japan, or mainstream Japanese sense of Japan.
We just have time for two final questions, so we'll bunch them together in this one, but we'll bunch them and then you'll answer the ones you feel like answering.
I noticed earlier when you were talking about the race of countries towards modernity that you used the pronoun he. I was just wondering what you think the role of women in all of this is.
In all of what?
We put the three questions together.
All right, okay.
Three.
You said about that the Western model, that the Western model is perhaps is not economic model, modernity model is not sustainable for Asia. But I think for the Asian nations, it was the reason to work very hard. People, they are keen to get this kind of wealth of the Western people. How? If this vision is no longer sustainable, what will happen with people who want to get this wealth?
And then, George, just one or two sentences.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say, I think we should more focus on the determinateness of United States and China to pursue their superiority and hegemony. Thank you.
So, almost final word is yours, because mine is a real final word.
I think, let me try and answer the first question. It's a very complicated question. You know, what does being modern mean? Say, if you were a woman in India in the early 20th century, it signified a kind of liberation from any number of oppressive traditional practices. You know, if you were a woman in China, for instance, foot binding, that was a major release when that was outlawed. And so many people could come out of their homes and participate in public life. And you know, for many Chinese communists, for many Chinese modernists, this was a major issue. But there were obviously emancipatory possibilities, not just for women, but for all kinds of people attached to modernity at that point in the early 20th century. The problem as it began to emerge was this was not something that you could just buy very cheaply, these little liberations, that it involved a larger reconfiguring of your society, in which even the little victories turned into defeats. So even if you were able to leave your home, for instance, and work and participate in the workplace as a woman, soon you realize that you're being horribly exploited in the workplace. As a woman, your labor wasn't measured, wasn't kind of deemed as valuable as the kind of work being put in by a male, and that you worked longer hours, you had little maternity leave. So all these, and this is just one example of how that kind of modernity which offered release could also turn into a kind of prison for many people. And there was obviously other kinds of trade-offs, motherhood and various other things that one also lost in the process. That was more difficult to have children, more difficult to raise a family. So this is the complicated bit, and these are the kind of decisions that if Asian countries had this autonomy to take, had the space in which to make their own decisions about what kind of modernity do they want. Do they really want to put, all these people, all their citizens, hard at work, and make them, basically work all day so that national productivity could go up? Was it really advisable to embrace that kind of model, or could we have embraced a different model where women or other minorities would be ensured different forms of dignity, different forms of freedom, not just the freedom to work, which could easily turn into a source of oppression. But this is, I mean, these are the questions left unanswered by our history, because we didn't, most countries didn't really have this, didn't have the space to work them out fully. We just ended up copying, imitating the West. And if you look at gender roles or the instance of gender discrimination, all the sort of supposedly modern societies, it's not a pretty picture. Today, I mean, it's in some ways it's a great advance over, late 19th century parts of India or parts of China, but it's not the great victory we can boast of today.
Thank you very much. I think to answer another question you raised, is that Asia seems, Japan looms very large in Asia, but Asia does not loom as large in Japan. I think one thing that struck me both in reading your book and hearing you talk is the reaction of the West to different Asian countries. I mean, Japan was here this first stage of leave Asia, join Europe. It was generally welcomed. I mean, after all, there was the alliance with Britain was the first real alliance of equals between a European and a non-European power. I mean, Britain was a senior partner, but it wasn't one of these unequal protectorates by any means. And then there was, of course, a period of rejection. I mean, something that really shocked Japanese were the exclusion acts in the United States, in Australia, the unwillingness to accept the clause for racial equality, or more precisely, really for Japanese equality in Versailles. But then afterwards, post-World War II, Japan was really accepted by the West. In fact, I have a Japanese friend, a former government official, who told me that modern Japan's two greatest achievements were that Japanese were considered to be honorary whites in the Third Reich and in South Africa. Maybe taken a little too far, but I think you see the point. And I think today, I mean, Japan is only alive in the United States. If you're Japanese, you travel on a Japanese passport, you don't need a visa to go to Europe, you don't need a visa to go to the US, you're treated as a citizen of a rich, respected country. And I think one thing that we've seen, you mentioned again the return, neo-Ottomanism, for example, in Turkey. In Turkey, Turkey's desire to leave Asia and join Europe was not reciprocated. I mean, Turks are told, well, European Union, doesn't really welcome you. I've never traveled on a Turkish passport in Europe, but I assume it's probably better to travel in Europe with a Japanese than as a Turk if you don't want to stand along at the long lines at immigration. So I think that may be one reason, is in a way the relationship in Asia between Japan and the West remains fairly positive from a Japanese point of view, which is very different, of course. And of course, Japan was never colonized by the West, and never colonized, period. I mean, Korea was not colonized by the West, it was colonized by Japan. So I think that partly explains the differences. But we very much, first we would like to thank Jeff for having made this possible. Thank you, Jeff. And we very much hope that you will be back. Obviously, if you're interested in Asia, one trip to Japan is not enough. So we very much hope to welcome you in the future. And we do sometimes actually organize lectures via Skype, and since you live in Europe, the time difference is right. We've done them for people in the US, but they really have to wake up very, very early. But in London, it's much easier. So we very much hope to have you again. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.